WIT Studio's remake of One Piece is coming soon, and it is set to solve the biggest problem that One Piece has always faced, which is accessibility. For decades, One Piece has been held back by the simple fact that there is no single, universally palatable version of the Series 2 experience. Regardless of whether it's the manga, the anime, the live action, or even the fan project One Piece, all of these mediums have a hard barrier to entry that have historically made it very difficult for One Piece to collect new fans. And you might be saying, Morch, this is outrageous. One Piece has become one of the biggest anime and manga series of all time. It is the best-selling manga of all time and dominates culture in Japan. And in the West, ever since the live action, One Piece has arguably become a household name comparable to Dragon Ball Z. We live in an era where huge influencers are picking up One Piece and spreading the word. So how can I say that One Piece has been held back from global popularity this whole time? Well, people look at One Piece's recent boom in popularity in the last several years and completely miss the point. One Piece has managed to gain the popularity it has despite the fact that every single medium to experience it out there is deeply flawed. And again, I'm including the manga in that, though I will explain why in the first section of this video. Unlike One Piece's popular contemporaries like Naruto and Bleach, that were essentially capitulated into popularity in the West thanks to their animes, and of course recent series like Demon Slayer and Jujutsu Kaisen, whose animes took modestly popular manga and elevated them to global phenomenons, One Piece has had to slowly and steadily over the decades earn the large global following that it enjoys today, despite its original anime holding it back. One Piece has only reached the heights that it has because at the end of the day, the core story is unrivaled in the shonen sphere. But it has always been difficult to get new people to try to push themselves to get far enough into that story to really begin to appreciate it. And it's not because there's something fundamentally boring about the storyline of East Blue. If anything, the live action showed that just the East Blue saga can captivate audiences everywhere. No, what One Piece has desperately needed for years and years is a proper way to introduce someone into the series. And all this time, both the Viz manga and the Toei anime have acted as severe bottlenecks that have prevented One Piece from immediately blowing up in popularity the way that it did in Japan. But with the WIT Studio version, there is finally a chance for there to simply be a single clear starting point to direct new viewers to. And when this anime finally airs, it is going to launch One Piece's already large global popularity to the moon. So before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. But first, I want to show you a new way to bring your phone to life. Thanks to an app called Live Wallpapers HD 4K, the sponsor of this video, it's completely changed how my phone looks. I've been using this for weeks, and right now my favorite is the Luffy Gear 5 wallpaper. You get access to thousands of wallpapers, and my favorite thing about them is that a lot of them are vivid and alive, moving wallpapers. And they've got countless genres like gaming, sports, and most importantly, all of your favorite anime characters. These aren't just static images, these are animated 4K live wallpapers that make your screen feel more dynamic without draining your battery. What I like most is that new wallpapers are added every day, so you're not stuck looking at the same thing forever. Just open the app, find something you like, and apply it with a single tap. The app already has over 10 million downloads and a 4.4 star rating, so a lot of people are using it to customize their phones. If you're ready to give your phone a glow up, then check out the link in the description and download Live Wallpapers HD 4K. Instantly upgrade your phone with live 4K wallpapers. So the first and maybe most controversial take that I want to put out there to address is that there is a flaw with the manga, and the manga is not the right way to experience One Piece. Well, here's the thing. I want to be very specific. The manga of One Piece is the true and best way to experience it, in my opinion, if you are reading the right translation. And the Viz translation is certainly not that. To understand what I mean, we need to separate pre- and post-timeskip Viz translation. With post-timeskip Viz translation, a lot of people have minor critiques. Stuff like Zolo is still made fun of, and a lot of the dialogue feels a little bit clunky and not really natural. But post-timeskip Viz dialogue is still very readable, and it's very good for accuracy. But what a lot of readers don't know is that this was not the case pre-timeskip. The Viz translator that we have today for post-timeskip is named Stephen Paul. He was a very well-renowned fan translator for One Piece during its pre-timeskip days. And Stephen Paul was so good at what he did, and the Viz translations used to be so bad, that around the timeskip, Viz actually hired him on to fix their translations. And from then on, we've had the Viz translations that most people are used to today. But that means that a lot of people are generally not familiar with what the Viz translations used to be like pre-timeskip. And a lot of you might be saying, wait, Morge, we caught up to One Piece reading the manga online, and the translations that we found were always good. but it's very, very likely that the translations that you read online were not the Viz translations, but rather fan translations. For the vast majority of the time that One Piece manga scans have been online and freely available for people to read on various websites, what those sites tend to have are the fan versions of those translations, which are generally good and very readable. But over the years, there's been more and more crackdown on these sort of sites. And so slowly we've reached a point where really all that's easily accessible out there are the Viz translations, and these are also the translations that people get to read in volume. Meaning if you're telling a new prospective One Piece fan how to get into the series, and they're complaining that there's too many episodes, and you instead say, well, why don't you try reading the manga? Well, if they go online, it's most likely what they're going to be hit with is the Viz version of the manga, and of course if they choose to buy volumes from the store, then they're basically reading the most trash version of One Piece imaginable. And I think a lot of people may not understand just how bad Viz One Piece was pre-timeskip. It is genuinely not even the same series. There is a reason that Viz ultimately had to hire some fan to fix all of their translations for post-timeskip, because pre-timeskip it was just that bad. Pre-timeskip Viz translations are to the manga what the 4Kids dub was to the anime, in that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the type of story that One Piece is. So all of the Viz pre-timeskip dialogue is written in a very childish and shallow manner that completely neuters all of the depth and impact of the series' writing. The easiest way to observe this is if you go to a Viz version of literally any iconic One Piece quote or bit of dialogue, and you will immediately see what I mean. Let's read along. Are the pirates the bad guys? Is the Navy the good guys? Things like that change with the seasons. It's the job of those at the top to decide what's good and what's evil. Right now, it could go either way. Justice will prevail? Of course it will, because the side of justice will be whichever side wins. Yeah, it's roughly the same thing as what is actually being said, but it's essentially taking a very poetic speech and simplifying the dialogue to what a kid might be able to read. And so many of One Piece's best moments are completely ruined in this manner. Fight me, you big pussycat. I know a few ways to skin one. Who talks like this? I would encourage you right now to go through the pre-timeskip and find some of your favorite quotes, scenes, or bits of dialogue, and see how just even in small ways, small changes in phrasing, pre-timeskip Viz somehow manages to neuter the impact of otherwise great quotes, such that someone who catches up to One Piece by watching it on Crunchyroll with subtitles, and someone who catches up to One Piece by reading the English Viz volumes, will have zero overlap in terms of their knowledge of iconic quotes and bits of dialogue. It's genuinely like experiencing a different series, and it's not just about the complexity of language or the weight behind it. Pre-timeskip Viz straight up assassinates certain character moments by fundamentally misunderstanding any sort of nuance in a scene. Essentially, while I would say that the best way to experience One Piece as is by far is the manga, what I'm referring to is the fan-translated manga that most readers would have caught up with. But just imagine how many readers have tried One Piece through the official volumes and then immediately dropped it because it basically reads like a book for 5-year-olds. And to make matters worse, again, in recent years, the sites that have the fan translations are being cut down one by one. I still have links to the good fan-translated versions, but it's very possible that even those sites' days are numbered. Just recently, my favorite site to go back and read One Piece in beautiful digital color, with the good translations, chose to delete everything and replace it with the Viz version in color. Don't worry, I've sent a strongly worded email, and I would strongly encourage you all to do the same if you want to preserve One Piece's good translations and be able to read them in color, but that's up to you. The point is that even the manga, which should be the holy text, the original version of One Piece, is completely ruined by the official translation. And the official translation has likely turned away probably hundreds of thousands of potential readers over the decades. So today when somebody asks me how to get into One Piece, and I try to point them towards the manga, if they are not already a seasoned sort of anime and manga fan, their first instinct is to read the physical volumes or the official version online, and it takes an extra layer of convincing to be like, no, don't actually read those books, the books are terrible, you have to read it on this specific janky site that I'm sharing with you. As surprising as it may sound from me, if a new person is trying One Piece and the options are the manga or the Toei anime, I would never recommend anyone to actually go and read a physical One Piece volume to start with. If someone's gotta bite the bullet with one or the other, the Toei anime is actually a better bet, but of course, that isn't perfect either. So the Toei anime and I have had a long-time love-hate relationship. I personally got into One Piece watching the Toei anime, and it was right around the tail end of Enies Lobby that I kind of made the transition between being an anime viewer to a weekly manga reader. With the good fan translations, of course. And the simple problem with the Toei anime that is reflected in the fact that the whole series is being remade as a new anime actively while the old anime is still running is that the current Toei anime is extremely imperfect. While the anime as a whole has phenomenal voice acting performances and a great OST, the actual animation and scene direction choices make it very, very, very difficult for new anime fans to get into without a lot of convincing, because it simply becomes such a titanic and iconic story that they're willing to sort of power through to get to experience that story in totality. And it's a huge testament to the quality of One Piece's writing and story that despite the anime having so many flaws, once you get anyone far enough into the series, they become hooked for life. But it shouldn't have to be that way. An animated adaptation should fundamentally make it easier for people to get into the story, not some sort of challenge that people want to undertake. And the simple problem with the One Piece anime is that it's a tale of two halves, and both have flaws. Pre-time skip, the animation is just very, very dated at this point, and frankly, it was dated even when it was coming out. Fights in pre-time skip One Piece anime are very stiff, very awkwardly choreographed. In a time where we were getting used to things like Rock Lee versus Gaara, or Ichigo versus Byakuya, major One Piece fights like Luffy versus Arlong or Luffy versus Crocodile, while they have phenomenal storytelling, have almost no visual flair or fluidity. It really takes all the way up to Luffy versus Lucci, hundreds and hundreds of episodes deep into the story, before One Piece finally showcases that it can have high-octane, dynamic fights like you would expect from an anime. And keep in mind, One Piece was already well behind its contemporaries in terms of animation while it was airing back in those days. So imagine in 2026, when anime fans are used to Jujutsu Kaisen, Demon Slayer, Chainsaw Man, that quality of animation, nowadays getting them to start with something like East Blue level animation can feel like asking someone to go watch a silent black and white film from the 1930s. But in the second half of One Piece, we do see an uptick in animation quality. It takes a while, but I'd say starting with Luffy versus Katakuri, we start to get some really well animated fights. And Wano of course takes that trend up to 11, with some absolutely masterful animated sequences. But the post-time skip now has a new problem, which is that if someone powers through the highly dated animation of all of pre-time skip and gets to the post-time skip, well then suddenly they're hit with the pacing issues, of course. I really don't need to elaborate on this point. There is no world where a series that releases 19-page chapters should have an animated adaptation that somehow adapts less than one chapter per episode. A single page does not have a minute of visual runtime. The math does not add up. And so what post-time skip One Piece became is an often unwatchable mess of reaction shots, snail's pace scene direction, flashbacks to events that happened in the same episode, and zero effort filler. And it appears that at a certain point, Toei realized how badly they'd screwed up the entire post-time skip by dragging and dragging every beat of the story. So now they also actually appear to be remaking the One Piece post-time skip arcs as we speak, starting with Fishman Island, and finally switching over to seasonal and Elbaf, as they clearly should have done a decade ago, as is standard for most modern day anime that appreciates and attempts to elevate its source material. One Piece anime fan standards dropped so low for this series as the post-time skip progressed that while most other anime fans understood that a good episode meant, you know, a good episode in general, One Piece fans got to the point where they would claim that an episode is good if in an episode with a 4-minute recap, 3 flashbacks, 5 minutes of filler, dragged out reaction shots, there was a 2-minute sequence of Sakuga action. Yeah, I remember the dark days of Wano. We're in a 20-minute episode where if 18 minutes were mind-numbingly slow and dragged out, if there was a 2-minute flashy action sequence somewhere in there, then they would be crowing about how it's a really good episode. Fans essentially had to gaslight themselves into believing that one good clip means a good episode. And the craziest part is that even in a storyline like Wano, most episodes don't actually have a really flashy clip. So even in a supposedly well-done post-time skip anime arc like Wano, the reality is the viewer is faced with several episodes of terrible pacing and near zero plot progression before being fed 2 to 3 minutes of beautiful Sakuga action and then continuing the cycle, meaning that you could watch 60 minutes straight of Wano and get maybe 5 minutes that are actually enjoyable. And keep in mind I'm saying this after having gone back and watched the majority of Wano's best episodes after rampant criticism that I don't actually watch the anime, and from what I've observed, while the Sakuga sequences are amazing, you can take even the absolute single best rated episode in the Wano anime, Zoro vs. King, and even in the absolute peak episode of Toei's animation, it's really just the final clash that is phenomenally animated. The rest of the episode has bits of good animation and plenty of bits of very standard mid-level animation, and somehow even in this supposed masterpiece of an episode, it still for some reason suffers from absurdly long recaps, unnecessarily long breaks in what should be a fast-paced action sequence, and flashbacks to things that happened in this very same episode. And you can see these same sort of choices being made by the Toei team in other iconic episodes like Sanji vs. Queen or Robin vs. Black Maria. While there are phenomenal clips in there, the bulk of those episodes don't really hold up in comparison to how other modern anime do things. We saw an improvement with Egghead Island, where even if there isn't some sort of crazy beautiful action sequence going on, the slow pacing is somewhat smoothed over with much more creative scene direction. But ultimately, One Piece should have simply bit the bullet and gone seasonal a long time ago, and thankfully Elbaf will be adapted well. But that leaves the entirety of One Piece post-time skip from Fishman Island all the way through Wano as an absolute slog to get through. I cannot imagine, even amongst the most die-hard One Piece anime fan defenders, what percentage of them would actually sit down and watch the entire Wano arc in the anime from start to finish while resisting continuously hitting fast forward on their keyboard. So the actual One Piece manga volumes suck. The anime is severely flawed, hence why it is being remade. And then you have fan projects like One Piece, but number one, a lot of people have differing opinions as to how good of a job One Piece actually does in cutting out all the filler and fixing One Piece's pacing. And two, the bigger problem is, again, when it comes to accessibility, it's one thing to try and push someone to take on this vast undertaking that is One Piece, but if on top of that you're telling them to watch a fan-made version of it, it becomes just another sort of objection point or a barrier where they might be inclined to say, no, that seems weird. I would rather just watch it on Crunchyroll or Netflix or something easy. So even One Piece isn't a reliable way to get around One Piece's terrible pacing issues. And finally, that brings us to the live action. Now, the live action, in my opinion, has become the simplest way to get someone brand new into One Piece, especially if they're not already a manga and anime fan. And of course, the statistics agree with me. The One Piece live action became the most viewed Netflix show globally when it launched, and still retains really good numbers. And the important point is that it brought in a huge influx of new One Piece fans. It is since the One Piece live action that One Piece has really become a household name that is broadly recognizable in English-speaking countries. But the simple problem at the heart of it is the live action is not the true story of One Piece. And so here again, we get to the accessibility issue. The live action is a great way to introduce someone to the concept and general vibe of the series, but you're not actually bringing them into what One Piece actually is. It's a fundamentally different experience. And if somebody gets into the live action and really enjoys it, their next question is, okay, I like this story, how do I keep going? And then we hit that same fork, which is, okay, you could either recommend the manga and the physical volumes are terrible, or you could recommend the Toei animation and they get a few episodes in and drop it because it's just so slow and dated. There needed to be a way that brought the best of all these worlds together. Good translations that capture the real essence of the One Piece story in a medium that is easily palatable like animation. That is where the WIT's version of One Piece breaks the bottleneck open. Now we have a modern style anime that new potential anime viewers can easily get into, that's well-paced, properly told, and represents the dialogue correctly. I've seen lots of critiques of how the new anime looks, and people need to take off their rose-tinted glasses. The current version of East Blue that Toei has, while it holds a lot of nostalgia for us, we are already One Piece fans. No amount of classic charm is going to make the existing anime version of East Blue easier to get into for the majority of people than an updated modern version. WIT Studio does not need to put out an UFO table level adaptation. That is not the bar here. We never even expected that we were going to be getting a new version of the One Piece anime for decades and decades. Beggars cannot be choosers here. The WIT Studio version just needs to be better paced, visually sleeker, and have better animated fights than what we already have. And that is an incredibly low bar to get over. So instead of nitpicking all of the things you see about the WIT Studio anime, appreciate the fact that we finally have a good universal gateway to get new people into the series, and potentially the definitive version with which to experience One Piece. So I'm very much looking forward to this, and let me know in the comments below if you are as well. And if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear my extended thoughts on the one area where the new anime may not live up to what we already have, you can listen to my weekly podcast that just dropped by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon. Link in the description below.